Before we continue, pause for a moment. Almost everything you do to appear successful may be working against you. Solomon observed that many people do not go bankrupt due to a lack of money, but because of the constant effort to impress. The right clothes, the right words, a life on display, and inside pressure. Solomon saw wealth, power, and admiration at the highest level, and he understood something simple. Those who live to be seen rarely build anything that lasts. The applause comes quickly. The price comes later. Today, you'll understand why Solomon would tell you to stop trying to impress, and how this silent habit drains your peace, your decisions, and your stability, even when everything seems to be going well. If this message resonates with you, leave a like now. This helps this content reach people who are also tired of living to prove something. And subscribe to the channel. Here, we're not talking about earning more at any cost. We talked about making fewer mistakes in the decisions that define your life. Stay with me until the end. This video could save you years. You don't start by trying to impress. You start by trying to belong. Solomon observed that the desire to impress rarely stems from true ambition. It arises from silent comparison. Someone earns more. Someone seems to live better. Someone receives more attention. And, without realizing it, the mind enters a race that was never planned. The problem is that this race has no finish line. Solomon understood that when a person begins to measure their worth by the reactions of others, they lose control of their own decisions. The focus shifts from building something solid to maintaining an acceptable image. And images require constant maintenance. You trade what makes sense for what grabs your attention. Trade what is stable for what seems advanced. Trade what is necessary for what is admired. Solomon observed intelligent people making poor decisions, not for lack of information, but for fear of appearing small. They bought what they didn't need. They accepted commitments they couldn't sustain. They adopted postures that didn't represent who they really were, all to avoid the discomfort of failing to impress. And the mistake doesn't appear at the moment of the decision. He shows up later. The need to impress makes you spend before you think, speak before you understand, decide before you feel secure. And in the short term, this even works. People notice. They comment. They validate. But Solomon warned that initial applause almost always hides a future cost. Those who live to impress need to repeat the spectacle. And repeating the same thing is expensive. Solomon understood that this behavior creates a dangerous cycle. The more you impress, the more you need to maintain the image you've created. And the more you maintain it, the less freedom you have to change course. You become a prisoner of others' expectations. This is where many confuse ambition with vanity. Ambition builds in silence. Vanity needs witnesses. Ambition accepts the process. Vanity demands immediate results. Solomon observed that those who confuse these two things accelerate decisions that should mature over time. And here's the hook that few people realize. The problem isn't wanting to grow. The problem is growing too quickly to be seen. When that haste is guided by the opinions of others, it almost always points in the wrong direction. Solomon saw people abandoning promising paths simply because they didn't generate immediate status. Solid projects were set aside for flashy shortcuts. Balanced relationships were traded for convenient alliances, all in the name of the appearance of progress. And, little by little, something is lost. A person might even make financial progress for a while. They might even gain recognition. But they lose clarity. They lose peace. You lose the ability to make calm decisions. Because every decision starts to answer an invisible question: what will others think? Solomon warned that when this question dominates the mind, wisdom departs. Life becomes a stage. And those who live on the stage never rest. In the next section, you'll understand why this seemingly harmless habit not only drains money, but also erodes stability, focus, and peace of mind over time. That's when the real price begins to show. The habit of trying to impress doesn't destroy everything at once. It corrodes little by little. Solomon observed that the greatest harm in life comes not from clearly wrong decisions, but from socially applauded choices. Choices that seem normal, even admirable, but carry a silent weight. The problem is that this weight doesn't show up on the first month statement. It accumulates. Solomon understood that when a person begins to live to maintain an image, they end up spending too much energy on the exterior and too little attention on the foundation. And no structure can withstand that for very long. At first, everything seems under control. The purchase fits within the budget. The lifestyle seems compatible. The pace seems sustainable. But Solomon warned that the mistake lies not in the size of the expense, but in the logic that sustains it. Those who buy to impress never buy just once. They buy to maintain a narrative. And narratives require continuity. The first sign of erosion is financial. You start organizing your income not to grow, but to appear stable. Fixed commitments increase. The margin for error decreases. Any unforeseen event becomes a threat. Solomon observed that a person doesn't realize when they cease to be the master of their money and become a servant of their own image. Then comes the mental exhaustion. Solomon understood that maintaining appearances requires constant vigilance. You need to remember what you showed, what you promised, the standard you created. This steals focus. It steals clarity. It steals presence. The mind is never free because it is always comparing, adjusting, justifying. It is at this point that decisions begin to be made to alleviate pressure, not to build a future. A job is accepted solely for the status. A certain cost of living is maintained so as not to appear to regress. Change of course is avoided because it could generate questions. Solomon observed that the fear of explanations is more deterrent than the lack of money. The third stage is emotional exhaustion. When life becomes a showcase, a person disconnects from what truly matters. They lose the pleasure of simplicity. Everything needs to be validated. Everything needs to be shown. And when something cannot be displayed, it seems to have no value. Solomon warned that this is a clear sign of inner impoverishment, even when the exterior seems prosperous. Over time, corrosion erodes the identity. People no longer know if they want something or if they just want to be seen wanting it. Decisions cease to reflect convictions and begin to reflect expectations. Solomon understood that this is a dangerous point, because when you lose touch with your own criteria, any external opinion gains power. And the most ironic thing is that all this happens while the person seems to be progressing. Promotions, recognition, apparent success. But inside, the structure is compromised. Solomon observed that many falls begin precisely at the peak of appearances, when no one imagines that something is wrong. Time reveals the cost. The debt isn't just financial. It's a debt of energy, focus, and peace. People wake up tired without knowing exactly why. They feel anxious even when things are going well. Because maintaining an image consumes resources that should be used to build something real. Solomon warned that the mistake is not in having good things. The mistake is when these things begin to demand more from you than you can comfortably give. At that moment, they cease to serve and begin to command. In the next section, you'll understand why this habit pushes away precisely what people seek most when trying to impress: security, lasting growth, and freedom of choice. That's where Solomon's logic becomes impossible to ignore. There's a contradiction that Solomon observed clearly. The more someone tries to appear successful, the further they get from what truly sustains success. Solomon understood that lasting wealth doesn't come from noise, but from consistency. And consistency requires choices that almost never impress at first. Therefore, those who live to be seen end up choosing paths incompatible with building something solid. The first divergence occurs in how money is handled. Solomon observed that wealth thrives on margin, not tightness. It grows where there is room for error, patience to wait, and discipline to repeat correct decisions. But those who try to impress live on the edge. Everything is calculated to fit, never to have excess. And where there is no excess, nothing grows. This behavior creates a dangerous illusion. The person believes they are progressing because the external pattern is improving. But internally, the structure becomes increasingly fragile. Solomon warned that progress without a foundation is merely movement. And constant movement is tiring, but it doesn't get you far. Then, the pursuit of fame pushes away stability. Stability demands predictability, conservative choices, and respect for one's own pace. But this rarely attracts attention. What attracts attention is the leap, the risk, the quick result. Solomon observed that many abandon sensible decisions because they don't generate immediate admiration. And without realizing it, they exchange stability for exposure. The same is true of peace. Solomon understood that peace is born when inner and outer life are aligned, when you can stand by your choices without needing to explain them. But those who live to impress are always defending themselves, always justifying, always adjusting their discourse to the audience. And this internal fragmentation exacts a silent price. Over time, the mind enters a state of constant alert. There's a fear of losing the standard, a fear of disappointing, a fear of seeming less. Solomon observed that this fear does not arise from a lack of resources, but from a lack of inner security. And no amount of external recognition can correct that. The absence of sustainable growth occurs because important decisions cease to be made based on the future and begin to be made based on immediate impact. Investments that require patience are ignored. Lengthy processes are avoided. Consistent paths are considered too slow. Solomon warned that time is the greatest ally of construction, but the greatest enemy of vanity. Another critical point is that the need to impress distorts the perception of risk. People end up taking risks they cannot sustain simply to maintain a narrative of success. Solomon understood that risk is not the problem. The problem is taking risks without the structure to absorb the fall. And when the fall comes, it doesn't come small. Often, it comes in the form of irreversible choices, long-term commitments, emotional and financial debts, fragile professional relationships, everything decided under pressure to maintain an image. Solomon observed that those who decide to impress rarely have the freedom to correct themselves afterward. Ultimately, what most hinders wealth, stability, and peace is the silent trade-off that takes place. Depth is traded for visibility. Solidity is traded for speed. Freedom is traded for approval. And these trade-offs seem advantageous at first, but they exact high interest over time. Solomon warned that life doesn't immediately demand payment for this type of choice. It demands it later, when exhaustion sets in, when anxiety creeps in, when the feeling of always running but never arriving becomes constant. In the next section, you will understand the principles Solomon used to protect himself from this trap and how it can be applied today to build a more solid, freer life, less dependent on the opinions of others. This is where the logic changes. There comes a point when a person realizes they are too tired for the point they've reached. Solomon watched this moment attentively. He understood that the effort to impress demands a kind of payment that doesn't appear in numbers, but in wear and tear. A person wakes up already tired, even without physical exertion. They feel constant pressure, even when everything seems organized. This happens because maintaining an image requires continuous vigilance, and constant vigilance is exhausting. Solomon understood that when life becomes a stage, rest disappears. There is no true pause, because there is always something to sustain. A pattern, an expectation, a character. The person does not allow themselves to fail in silence. They do not allow themselves to simplify. Everything needs to appear consistent with the constructed image. This is the point at which anxiety sets in. Solomon observed that anxiety doesn't stem from too many problems, but from too much control. Those who try to impress try to control how they are seen, how they are interpreted, how they are compared, and that's impossible to sustain. The mind enters a cycle of anticipation and fear. Fear of losing, fear of seeming less, fear of not keeping up. Over time, this pressure alters behavior. The person begins to avoid decisions that could bring relief, simply because they might generate judgment. A step back that would be strategic begins to seem like humiliation. A reduction in pace that would bring clarity begins to seem like failure. Solomon observed that the fear of appearing small is more binding than any real difficulty. Emotional exhaustion begins to reflect in relationships. The person becomes defensive, comparative, and impatient because they are always measuring their worth, success, and position. Solomon understood that this corrodes bonds, transforming coexistence into silent competition. Another profound effect is the loss of authenticity. The person no longer responds to what they feel, but to what they expect to be accepted. They fit in too quickly. They mold themselves too much, until one day they no longer recognize their own rhythm, their own limits, their own desires. Solomon warned that this is an invisible but devastating impoverishment. In the long run, the psychological cost manifests as emptiness. Even with external achievements, something is missing, because the decisions weren't made to nurture life, but to sustain an image. And images don't restore energy. They only consume it. Solomon observed that many people confuse discipline with rigidity. They think they need to endure everything, so as not to damage their image. But what is really damaging them is the inability to adjust course without feeling ashamed. When every change needs to be explained, freedom disappears. This constant fatigue also affects mental clarity. The person loses the ability to think long-term. They live constantly putting out emotional and financial fires, created by the need to maintain their standard of living. Solomon understood that those who live like this are not building anything. They are merely sustaining. And here is the most dangerous point: when burnout becomes normal, when anxiety becomes routine, when exhaustion is treated as the inevitable price of success. Solomon warned that this is a sign that something is deeply out of alignment. In the next section, you will understand the simple principle that Solomon used to escape this trap. A principle that doesn't draw attention, doesn't generate applause, but builds freedom, clarity, and peace over time. This is where the logic is reversed. There's a silent choice that changes everything. Solomon understood this choice better than most. After witnessing wealth, power, admiration, and downfall, he realized that true protection lay not in acquiring more, but in reducing mistakes. And the greatest of these was making decisions in front of an audience. That is why Solomon warned, decisions made to be seen are almost never made to last. The principle was simple, yet demanding: to build without announcing, to grow without proving, to choose without explaining. Solomon understood that everything that needs applause to make sense carries a hidden fragility. What is solid endures even in silence. This principle completely changes the way we live. When you stop trying to impress, money ceases to be a tool for validation and becomes an instrument for building. Choices become calmer. Commitments become more conscious. Margin emerges. And margin is where stability is born. Solomon observed that true wealth grows where there is room to make mistakes without breaking. Peace also returns. Without the need to maintain an image, the mind slows down. Decisions cease to respond to the expectations of others and begin to respond to reality. You start choosing what makes sense in the long term, even if it seems small now. Solomon understood that tranquility is a sign of alignment, not stagnation. Another powerful effect is clarity. When there is no audience, the truth emerges. It becomes easier to recognize limitations, adjust course, and abandon what doesn't work. Solomon warned that wisdom doesn't shout. It whispers, and only those who live in sufficient silence can hear it. This principle also restores freedom. The freedom to change your mind without having to justify yourself, to slow down without feeling diminished, to grow at your own pace. Solomon observed that those who don't need to impress aren't stuck in the past because they don't need to uphold old narratives. And the most interesting thing is that, by ceasing to try to impress, real progress accelerates. Not at the pace of appearances, but at the pace of consistency. Small, correct decisions, repeated without applause, build more than grand gestures made to be seen. Solomon understood that time favors those who respect the process. This is not an invitation to live in hiding. It's an invitation to live fully, to let the results speak for themselves at the right time, to allow the foundation to be more important than the showcase. Solomon observed that those who live this way may seem slow to others, but they never lose themselves. Final closing. Perhaps the next step in your life isn't about doing more, showing more, or proving more. Maybe it's time to stop. Stop making decisions out of fear of judgment. Stop wasting energy on appearance. Stop supporting what doesn't support you. Solomon did not teach how to earn more. He taught them how to make fewer mistakes. And sometimes, making fewer mistakes starts with a simple decision: living without an audience.